The sound of the wind is the only clock that matters in the heart of the Taklamakan Desert, a low rhythmic sighing that has persisted for thousands upon thousands of years. In the local tongue, the name of this place carries a heavy warning, often translated as the place of no return, or he who goes in never comes out. It is a vast, undulating sea of shifting silt and sand dunes that reach toward the clouds, located within the Tarim Basin of western China, a geographical bowl rimmed by some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth. To the north lie the heavenly mountains, the Tian Shan. To the south, the Kunlun Range stands like a jagged wall of ice and stone. Between these giants lies a wasteland so dry, so relentlessly arid, that time itself seems to have been parched into a standstill. The sand is not merely a covering here, it is a preservationist. It is a silent golden ocean that has swallowed cities, kingdoms, and entire lineages of people whose names have been scrubbed from the ledgers of history. For centuries, this region was a void on the map to the Western world, a place of whispers and ghost stories told by Silk Road traders who skirted its lethal edges. But beneath the surface, protected by a chemistry of extreme dryness and soil rich in natural salts, something impossible was waiting. While the rest of the world's ancient dead turned to dust, the inhabitants of the Tarim Basin were being slowly turned into statues of leather and bone, their hair remaining braided, their clothes retaining the vibrant dyes of the day they were woven, and their faces frozen in expressions of eternal, quiet sleep. The story of their rediscovery begins not with a shovel, but with the grit and determination of early 20th century explorers who felt the pull of the deep past. Men like the Swedish geographer Sven Hedin and the Hungarian-British archaeologist Aurel Stein ventured into these wastes during an era when the map of Central Asia was still being inked. They were searching for the ruins of lost Buddhist kingdoms and the outposts of the Han dynasty. But what they found challenged the very foundations of how we understand the movement of ancient peoples. As they brushed away the fine, powdery silt of the desert, they did not find the expected features of East Asian ancestors. Instead, they looked down into the faces of people who looked like they had wandered off a mountain path in northern Europe or the steppes of the West. It is a strange sensation to look upon a face that has been dead for nearly 4,000 years and recognize the bridge of the nose, the shape of the jawline, or the reddish-blonde hue of the hair. These were not the dusty skeletons one might expect from such an immense gulf of time. These were mummies, though not mummies in the Egyptian sense. There were no oils, no resins, and no elaborate eviscerations performed by priests. Their preservation was a gift from the earth itself, a process of natural desiccation where the moisture was pulled from the body so rapidly that decay simply gave up. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, perhaps you can imagine the stillness of that desert air. You are in the right place to let the weight of the day fade away. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new journeys into the forgotten corners of history every single day, weaving these tales of the past to help you find a peaceful rest. If you find comfort in these long-lost stories, please do consider subscribing so you never miss a nightly narration. And a gentle like on the video helps our small archive reach others who are also seeking a quiet escape. Now, let us return to the silence of the sands and the secrets they held for so long. The explorers of the early 1900s were baffled by what they saw emerging from the dunes. At sites like Lula and the small river cemetery known as Xiaohe, the dead were buried in strange boat-shaped wooden coffins turned upside down and covered with cowhides. When the lids were lifted, the occupants appeared almost as if they were merely napping. They wore woolen cloaks. heavy, intricately woven fabrics with patterns that bore a striking resemblance to Celtic tartans. They wore felt hats adorned with feathers and silver jewelry that spoke of a culture far removed from the dynasties of the East. Their skin was pale, their eyes were deep-set, and their height was often greater than that of the populations currently living in the region. This discovery sent ripples through the scientific community that are still felt today. It forced a confrontation with the concept of deep time, the idea that the world was far more interconnected in the Bronze Age than we ever dared to dream. These people lived in the Tarim Basin as early as 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, a period that overlaps with the building of the pyramids and the rise of the first great civilizations. Yet, here they were, thousands of miles away from Europe, settled in a desert oasis in the far west of what is now China. The question of who they were, and where they came from, became one of the great enigmas of modern archaeology. To understand how they survived, we must look at the unique stratigraphy of the region. Stratigraphy is a term archaeologists use to describe the layers of the earth, like the pages of a book, where each deeper layer represents an older chapter of time. In the Tarim Basin, the stratigraphy is often interrupted by the shifting nature of the dunes, but the dryness remains constant. Because the basin is so far from any ocean and shielded by mountains, it receives almost no rainfall. The salt in the soil acted as a natural curing agent. Much like how meat is preserved, this extreme environment prevented the bacteria that cause decomposition from ever taking hold. And so, the mummies remained, suspended in a state of biological limbo. While empires rose and fell, while the Silk Road flourished and eventually faded, these individuals stayed tucked away in their sandy chambers. They were there during the time of the Roman Empire. They were there when the Great Wall was being built. And they were there when the first explorers finally arrived with their brushes and cameras. The preservation is so perfect that researchers have been able to analyze their last meals, finding traces of ancient grains and dairy, suggesting a pastoral lifestyle that relied on cattle and sheep. As the years passed, more sophisticated methods were brought to bear on the mystery. Radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, confirmed that the oldest of these mummies dated back to the early second millennium, before the Common Era. Some theories suggested they might be linked to the movements of people following the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate cooling that occurred much earlier, roughly 12,900 years ago. While the mummies themselves are not that old, the environmental shifts of the deep past may have created the corridors that allowed their ancestors to migrate across the vast Eurasian steppe. The mystery, however, is not just about their physical appearance, but about the silence they left behind. They left no written records, no scrolls or inscriptions to tell us their names or their gods. They left only their bodies and the beautiful, haunting objects they took with them into the earth. There were small baskets woven with such precision they could still hold water, wooden carvings that hinted at a complex spiritual life, and the remains of ephedra, a medicinal plant that suggests they possessed a sophisticated knowledge of the natural world. As we look deeper into the shadows of the Tarim Basin, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a great historical puzzle. These were a people who existed on the fringes of the known world, a bridge between West and East that had been forgotten by the collective memory of humanity. They remind us that the story of our species is not one of isolated pockets of culture, but a long, meandering journey of nomads and dreamers who crossed mountains and deserts in search of a home. The wind continues to blow over the Xiaohe cemetery, carving new shapes into the dunes and uncovering, every so often, the edge of a wooden post or the corner of a woolen shroud. The desert does not give up its secrets easily. It yields them in fragments, one grain of sand at a time, and as we listen to the quiet pulse of the ancient world, we realize that these silent residents of the sands have much more to tell us. if we are patient enough to listen to the echoes they left behind in the dry, still air of the basin. The darkness of the desert night is absolute, a velvet curtain that has draped over these graves for nearly 4 millennia. In the absence of light, the mind begins to wonder about the first nights these people spent in the basin, huddling around fires, looking up at the same constellations that guide us today. They were strangers in a strange land, yet they made it their own, carving a life out of the salt and the silt. Their presence in the Tarim is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, a reminder that no matter how harsh the landscape, we have always sought to leave a mark, even if that mark is merely a well-preserved face, waiting in the dark to be remembered once more. As the silence of the Taklamakan settles over you, let your thoughts drift like the fine dust of the Tarim. The mysteries of the past are vast, but for now they are at rest. The mummies sleep in their boat-shaped coffins, and the desert wind continues its eternal song, a lullaby for a civilization that time forgot. But the earth remembered. Imagine the sound of timber creaking against a dry wind, not the sound of a ship at sea, but of a forest standing in the middle of a wasteland where no tree has grown for 1,000 years. In the heart of the Lop Nur Desert, there is a place known as the Xiaohe Cemetery, or the Small River Cemetery No. 5. It is perhaps one of the most surreal archaeological sites on our planet. From a distance, it appears as a massive sand dune, but as you draw closer, you see that the mound is bristling with more than 140 thick wooden poles. These are the trunks of poplar trees, weathered by the abrasive sands into silvered, ghostly monuments. They stand like a dense thicket of spears thrust into the earth, marking the resting places of a people who vanished before the first great wall was ever conceived. Some of these poles are shaped like oars, wide and flat, while others are tall and cylindrical, and they have stood there, defiant against the shifting dunes, for nearly 4,000 years. Archaeologists who first arrived at this remote location felt as though they had stepped into a different dimension. The site is a complex layered structure, a mound built of sand and wood, where the dead were laid to rest in layers, one above the other. But it is what lies beneath these poles that captures the imagination so completely. The coffins themselves are shaped like inverted boats, hollowed-out logs that were covered with fresh cowhide while the leather was still wet. As the hide dried in the desert heat, it shriveled and tightened, sealing the contents in an airtight, sterile grip. This accidental stroke of genius by an ancient culture created a natural vacuum, preserving the occupants with such fidelity that they seem merely to be napping between the folds of time. And so we come to the most famous resident of this silent city, the woman known as the Beauty of Xiaohe. When the archaeologists carefully peeled back the layers of leather and wool from her boat-shaped coffin, they did not find a skeletal remains or a withered husk. Instead, they found a woman who appeared to have passed away only yesterday. Her skin remains soft to the touch in some places, her long light brown hair is still lustrous, and her eyelashes, thick and dark, are perfectly intact, casting soft shadows upon her cheekbones. She rests with a slight, enigmatic smile, as if she is privy to a secret that the living have long since forgotten. She lived roughly 3,800 years ago, yet her features are startlingly familiar to a modern observer. She possesses a high-bridged nose, deep-set eyes, and a facial structure that leans toward the Western Eurasian or Caucasian phenotype. This discovery sent ripples through the scientific community, challenging the long-held assumption that the ancient inhabitants of the Tarim Basin were exclusively of East Asian descent. Here, in the deep interior of what is now China, was a woman who looked as though she might have walked out of a village in the Caucasus or the steppes of Eastern Europe. As you look upon her, your eyes are drawn to the intricate details of her attire. She is dressed for a winter that never ended. She wears a tall, conical hat made of white felt, adorned with a single delicate feather. A touch of vanity, or perhaps a badge of status that has survived the millennia. Wrapped around her shoulders is a heavy woolen cape, fastened with wooden pins, its weave still strong and its texture visible to the naked eye. On her feet she wears soft leather boots, stitched with care to protect her from the abrasive sands of her homeland. Every stitch, every fibre of wool, and every piece of hide tells a story of a sophisticated textile culture that understood the properties of animal fibres and the necessity of warmth in the high desert nights. The preservation is so absolute that we can even see the small bundles of ephedra twigs placed carefully beside her. Ephedra is a medicinal plant, known for its stimulant properties and its use in ancient rituals across various cultures. In the context of the Xiaohe burials, these twigs are found in almost every grave, tucked into the clothing or laid across the chest. Perhaps it was a gift for the journey ahead, a way to stay awake and alert as she navigated the rivers of the afterlife. Or perhaps it was a sacred plant, a link between the physical world and the spirit realm, suggesting a belief system that valued the medicinal and the mystical in equal measure. The presence of these ephedra twigs, combined with the boat-shaped coffins, suggests a people who were deeply connected to the water, even though they lived in a region that is now one of the driest places on earth. The Tarim Basin was once a landscape of lush river valleys and wandering streams fed by the melting snows of the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountains. The Xiaohe people lived in a world of marshes and lakes, where the sound of water was a constant companion. They buried their dead in boats because the boat was the primary vessel of their lives. It was how they travelled, how they fished, and ultimately how they envisioned the transition into the great unknown. As the years passed and the climate shifted, the rivers began to retreat. The lush greenery withered, and the sand began its slow, relentless march across the valley floor. The people of Xiaohe eventually departed, leaving behind only their wooden poles and their silent ancestors. But the desert, in its harshness, provided a strange mercy. By drying out the land so completely, it halted the process of decay. It froze the beauty of Xiaohe in a moment of perpetual grace, allowing us, thousands of years later, to look into her face and recognize a fellow traveler. There is a profound weight to this realization, the understanding that our maps and our borders are temporary, but the movement of people is as ancient as the wind. These mummies are not just archaeological specimens, they are a bridge across deep time. They remind us that the history of the Silk Road did not begin with the Han dynasty or the Roman Empire, but with much older, much more mysterious migrations. The beauty of Xiaohe stands as a silent witness to a time when the world was more connected than we often dare to imagine. The wooden poles of the cemetery continue to bleach in the sun, their shadows lengthening and shortening with the passage of the days. They are the ribs of a forgotten world, protruding from the earth like the skeleton of a great beast. And tucked away in her boat, the woman with the felt hat and the ephedra twigs remains in her dreamless sleep, her presence a gentle whisper in the vast, echoing halls of history. We are left to wonder about the songs she sang, the languages she spoke, and the sights she saw before the sand claimed her world. In the stillness of the Taklamakan, the past is never truly gone. It is merely waiting for the wind to shift, revealing another face, another story, another life lived on the edge of the infinite. A single thread of crimson wool, spun so fine it seems to defy the passage of 3,000 years, catches the dim light of the laboratory. It is a small detail, a mere fragment of a life once lived. Yet it serves as the first clue to a man who would rewrite the history of the East. In the 1980s, as the desert winds of the Tarim Basin pulled back the heavy blankets of silt and salt, they revealed a figure so striking, so impossibly preserved, that he seemed merely to be resting between breaths. This is the one they call the Cherchen Man, a giant of his time, standing nearly 6 feet tall, his presence still commanding an aura of quiet authority even in the stillness of the tomb. As we look upon him, we see not a dusty relic, but a man of flesh and blood, his skin tanned to the colour of old parchment by the mineral-rich sands. His hair, a deep, vibrant shades of ginger and auburn, is braided intricately, falling over shoulders that once carried the weight of a life on the shifting frontiers of the ancient world. He was found in the Zagunluk cemetery, resting in a tomb lined with reeds, his eyes closed as if in a meditation that has lasted 30 centuries. He does not look like the inhabitants of modern China, nor does he resemble the nomadic tribes we might expect to find in this remote corner of the world. With his high-bridged nose, deep-set eyes, and long, rectangular face, he bears the unmistakable features of someone from the far west, perhaps from the rolling steppes of Europe, or the rugged highlands of the Caucasus. The clothing he wears is a marvel of ancient engineering, a testament to a level of craftsmanship that challenges our understanding of the Bronze Age. His trousers, perhaps the oldest ever discovered, are woven from wool in a complex twill pattern, a technique where the threads are offset to create a diagonal ribbing, providing both strength and flexibility for a life spent on horseback. The colours remain startlingly vivid: rich burgundies, deep yellows, and earthy browns, dyed with a precision that suggests a deep knowledge of the plants and minerals of the earth. These are not the garments of a primitive wanderer, but the attire of a sophisticated culture, one that valued aesthetics as much as utility. As we trace the patterns of the weave, we are reminded that the Silk Road was not a sudden invention of the Han dynasty, but a path worn smooth by the feet of countless nameless travellers long before the first chronicles were ever written. Beside the Cherchen Man lay 3 women and, most poignantly, a tiny soul whose journey was cut tragically short. This infant, wrapped in a shroud of soft brown wool, offers a glimpse into the tender, private grief of a family lost to time. The child was found with a small nursing bottle made from the bladder of a sheep, a delicate, translucent vessel with a teat fashioned from a piece of leather. It is a heart-breakingly human object, a reminder that the struggles of parenthood and the desire to nourish and protect the vulnerable are universal, transcending the boundaries of millennia. Next to the child lay a small piece of blue stone, a talisman perhaps, intended to guide the little one through the shadows of the great beyond. In the silence of the desert, one can almost hear the soft lullabies that must have been hummed in that tomb, a final gift of love before the stones were set in place. The mystery of the Cherchen Man deepens when we observe the markings upon his face, traces of yellow ochre, a natural earth pigment used by humans since the dawn of time, remain visible on his temples and cheeks, applied in swirling sun-like patterns. These are not accidental stains, but deliberate ritual markings. Were they intended to protect the deceased in the afterlife, or were they the insignias of his rank and lineage during his waking hours? We see similar markings on the women buried with him, suggesting a shared belief system or a communal identity that bound them together in both life and death. The use of ochre is a practice that stretches back to the Paleolithic, connecting these desert dwellers to a lineage of human ritual that spans tens of thousands of years. It is a silent language, a code written in iron oxide and grease, waiting for us to decipher its hidden meaning. Archaeologists utilize a variety of tools to pierce the veil of these forgotten ages, such as radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes to pin a moment in time, or stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the Earth to understand the chronological sequence of events. These methods tell us that the Cherchen Man lived around 1000 BCE, a time when the world was in a state of profound flux, and yet the science can only take us so far. It cannot tell us why he travelled so far from the lands of his ancestors, or what dreams he chased across the burning horizons of the Taklamakan. Was he a trader, a chieftain, or perhaps a refugee seeking a new beginning in a land where the mountains meet the sky? The environment that preserved him is as much a character in this story as the man himself. The Tarim Basin is a place of extremes, a high-altitude bowl, where the moisture is trapped by the encircling peaks of the Kunlun and the Tian Shan ranges. The salt-saturated soil and the hyper-arid climate acted as a natural mummification chamber, halting the slow march of decay. It is as if the earth itself conspired to keep these people secret, holding them in a state of suspended animation until the world was ready to see them again. As the years passed, the shifting dunes buried their settlements and their stories, leaving only these silent sentinels to bear witness to a civilization that flourished in the heart of Eurasia, far from the gaze of the great empires of the period. As we contemplate the Cherchen Man and his family, we are forced to confront the limits of our own maps. We often think of history as a series of neat boxes with east and west separated by impassable barriers of distance and culture. But here, in the cold, dry air of the tomb, those boundaries dissolve. We find a man with European features wearing sophisticated textiles, buried in the heart of China, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that was both foreign and familiar. He is a bridge across the ages, a reminder that the human story has always been one of movement, of curiosity, and of the courage to venture into the unknown. The stillness of the museum where he now rests is a far cry from the howling winds of the desert, yet the sense of mystery remains undiminished. We look at the nursing bottle, the twill trousers, and the ochre-painted faces, and we feel the weight of forgotten ages pressing against the present. There is a profound patience in these mummies, a willingness to wait for the centuries to turn, knowing that truth is patient and that the sand eventually gives up its secrets. In the presence of the Cherchen Man, we are reminded that we are all travellers on a very long road, and that the traces we leave behind, a thread of wool, a painted mark, a gesture of love, are the only things that truly endure. The shadows in the room seem to lengthen as we consider the vast stretches of time that separate us from his final breath. We think of the younger Dryas, that ancient period of abrupt cooling that shaped the world long before his birth, and the slow, steady drying of the basin that eventually claimed his home. The earth is a ledger of climate and change, recording the rise and fall of peoples in the very dust we walk upon. The Cherchen Man lived in a window of time, a brief moment of hospitable green before the desert reclaimed its dominion. And so we leave him to his rest, a red-haired ghost in a land of golden sand, his story a testament to the enduring spirit of those who dared to call the wilderness their home. The rustle of dry wool against skin is a sound that has echoed through the millennia, a soft friction that speaks of warmth, of labour, and of the very identity of the wearer. To look closely at the garments of the Tarim mummies is to peer into a microscopic world of interlaced threads, where every twist of the fibre tells a story of hands that moved with a rhythmic, practised grace. These were not the crude hides of a primitive people, but the sophisticated products of a culture that had mastered the loom long before the Great War was even a thought in the minds of kings. Among the most striking features of these ancient wardrobes are the intricate patterns woven into the fabric. The Cherchen Man and his kin were buried in twill tunics and trousers that bear a startling resemblance to the tartans of the Scottish Highlands. The weavers of the basin utilized a complex palette of reds, blues, and yellows, creating checkered designs that were not merely decorative, but perhaps served as a silent language, a way to signal kinship, status, or the specific valley from which a traveller hailed. When researchers first laid eyes on these vivid plaids, the shock was profound. The technology required to produce such a 3/1 twill weave is highly specific, and for a long time it was believed to be a hallmark of the early European Iron Age. As we trace these threads back through the fog of deep time, they lead us far to the west, across the vast Eurasian steppe to the salt mines of Hallstatt, Austria. In those dark, salt-preserved shafts, archaeologists discovered textile fragments from the first millennium before the Common Era that are, for all intents and purposes, identical to the cloth found in the Taklamakan Desert. The weave, the weight of the wool, and the specific arrangement of the colored stripes suggest a shared heritage that spans thousands of miles. It is as if a single tradition of craftsmanship was carried like a torch across the continent, surviving in the dry sands of the east and the salt crystals of the west. The secret to this artistry lies in the sheep. The wool used by the Tarim people did not come from the wild, scraggly sheep native to Central Asia, but from domesticated breeds with long, fine fleeces, animals that had been carefully bred and tended over generations. This reveals a profound connection to the land and a deep understanding of animal husbandry. To maintain such flocks, one cannot simply wander aimlessly. There must be a cycle, a seasonal rhythm of grazing and shearing that suggests a life more settled than we might expect. While we often imagine the ancient people of the steppe as restless nomads, the complexity of their textiles hints at a more sedentary existence, at least for part of the year. A loom is a heavy, stationary object, and the process of washing, carding, spinning, and dyeing wool is a slow, methodical task that requires a home base, a place where the weaver can sit in the dappled light and focus on the geometry of the thread. We see in these garments the birth of early weaving technology, a breakthrough that fundamentally changed the human experience. Before the loom, clothing was a matter of protection. After the loom, it became an expression of the soul. The Tarim mummies were wrapped in layers of this expression. They wore felt hats with tall, conical peaks, reminiscent of the headgear worn by the Scythians or the legendary wizards of Western folklore. They wore woolen leggings tied with bright ribbons and leather boots that still show the wear of walking on stony ground. Each stitch is a testament to the hours spent by a hearth, the quiet conversation of women as they worked, and the pride of a father providing for his children. The presence of these European-style textiles in the heart of Asia challenges our modern notions of borders and isolation. It suggests a world that was, in its own way, incredibly interconnected, a world where ideas and techniques traveled along the same paths as the sheep and the traders. This is the mystery of the weaver's art. It leaves a trail of breadcrumbs across the centuries, allowing us to reconstruct the movements of a people who left no written records. We are looking at a textile stratigraphy, a layering of cultural influence that predates the Silk Road by more than 1,000 years. As the wind moans across the dunes, one can almost hear the rhythmic thrum of the loom, a heartbeat of civilization in the wilderness. The sheep would have grazed on the sparse grasses of the riverbanks, their bells tinkling in the twilight, while inside the small sun-dried brick houses the weavers worked their magic. They were transforming the raw gifts of the earth into something beautiful, something enduring. They were weaving themselves into the fabric of history, unaware that 3,000 years later we would be marveling at the vibrancy of their dyes and the precision of their hands. There is a certain weight to this realization, a feeling of standing on the edge of a great canyon and looking across at a distant shore. We see the similarities in the cloth, we recognize the patterns, and we understand the technology, but the people themselves remain tantalizingly out of reach. Why did they bring these specific designs so far from their ancestral homes? Did the plaid patterns remind them of a landscape they had lost, or were they a new invention, born from the unique materials of the basin? The desert is a silent guardian of these secrets. It preserves the wool, but it withholds the intent. The clothing also provides a window into the climate of that era. The heavy woolen cloaks and lined trousers tell us of bitter winters and cool, high-altitude nights. These were people prepared for the elements, people who had adapted their wardrobe to survive in a land of extremes. But even in their practicality, there was a sense of aesthetic. They chose to use blue and red dyes when a simple brown would have sufficed. They chose to create complex patterns when a plain weave would have been easier. This tells us that even in the struggle for survival, beauty was a necessity. It was a way to assert their humanity against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert. As we contemplate the weaver's art, we must also consider the raw materials. The development of spinning, the act of twisting short fibers into a continuous, strong thread, is one of the most significant inventions in human history. It required an understanding of tension, of friction, and of the properties of different wools. The Tarim people were masters of this. Their threads are consistent and strong, capable of withstanding the tension of the loom and the wear of daily life. This mastery did not happen overnight. It was the result of thousands of years of trial and error, passed down from mother to daughter, a silent inheritance of skill. And so, the textiles of the Tarim mummies serve as a bridge. They connect the east to the west, the past to the present, and the nomad to the settler. They remind us that the story of humanity is not one of isolated pockets of progress, but a vast, tangled web of influence and migration. The Cherchen Man, in his colourful leggings and his finely woven tunic, is not just a relic of a lost civilization. He is a witness to the enduring power of human ingenuity. He stands as a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, we have always sought to clothe ourselves in beauty, to mark our place in the world with colour and pattern, and to leave behind something that says, "I was here." The silence of the basin is profound, but if you listen closely to the rustle of the sand, you might hear the ghost of a loom, the click-clack of the shuttle passing through the warp, the soft sigh of the weaver as she finishes a row. It is a peaceful sound, a sound of creation in a landscape of erosion. As we move deeper into the secrets of these mummies, we find that every discovery, every piece of cloth, and every strand of wool is a thread in a much larger tapestry, a tapestry that we are only just beginning to unroll. The colours may have faded slightly, and the fibres may have grown brittle with age, but the spirit of the maker remains, trapped in the weave, waiting for us to understand the story they were trying to tell. The first thing one notices when looking into the hollowed eyes of the earliest mummies is not their age, but their stillness. A profound, heavy quiet that has remained undisturbed for 4,000 years. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a chronological precipice, looking back to 2000 BCE, a time when the world was shifting, breathing, and expanding in ways that the modern mind often struggles to grasp. In the Tarim Basin, this era marks the beginning of a long, slow awakening. The sands of the Taklamakan were not always the desolate, shifting dunes we see today. They were a place of transition, where the echoes of the Stone Age began to harmonize with the metallic ring of a new era. As we peel back the layers of sediment, a process archaeologists call stratigraphy, or the study of how time stacks itself in the earth, we see a civilization in the midst of a quiet revolution. For millennia, the ancestors of these people relied on the sharp edges of flint and the weight of polished stone. But as the 3rd millennium BC drew to a close, a new substance began to appear in their graves. It was a cold, heavy material that could be melted, shaped, and honed into something far more durable than bone or rock. This was the arrival of bronze, and with it, the Tarim Basin was pulled into the grand, interconnected web of the Bronze Age horizon. Imagine a craftsman sitting by a small flickering fire, the smoke rising into a sky that was perhaps a deeper blue than the one we know today. In his hands, he holds a small casting of copper and tin. This metallurgy, was not a local invention born in isolation. Instead, it was a gift from the north and the west. The knowledge of how to bind these metals together travelled across the vast, undulating grass seas of the Eurasian steppe, carried by nomadic tribes who moved with the seasons and the stars. The Tarim mummies, with their tall statures and woven garments, were the recipients of this ancient technology. They were part of a cultural bridge that spanned thousands of miles, linking the forests of Europe and the plains of Central Asia to the fertile valleys of the East. The transition was not sudden, but rather a slow, deliberate blending of the old and the new. In the earliest burials, we find bronze knives and small ornaments resting alongside traditional stone scrapers, as if the living were hesitant to fully let go of the tools that had sustained their fathers for generations. It is a reminder of the patience of deep time, how change often arrives not as a storm, but as a rising tide, gradually reshaping the shoreline of human experience. These bronze artifacts are more than just tools. They are fingerprints of a wider world. The chemical composition of the metal often points toward ore sources far to the north, in the Altai Mountains or the Sayan Range, suggesting that even 4,000 years ago, the Tarim Basin was a crossroads of immense importance. We often speak of the Silk Road as a formal invention of the Han dynasty, a series of guarded outposts and official trade routes established in the 2nd century BCE. But the mummies tell a different story, a much older story. They reveal that the Tarim Basin was a vital artery of human movement long before the first bolt of silk ever travelled westward. It was a pre-Silk Road, a series of informal, wandering paths carved by the hooves of livestock and the feet of weary travellers. These early inhabitants were the pioneers of the interior, the ones who discovered the hidden springs and the sheltered oases that would later become the great cities of the desert. They were the silent witnesses to the first great exchange of ideas, languages, and technologies between the rising civilizations of the West and the East. As the years passed and the 2000 BCE mark was crossed, the sophistication of these people only grew. Their burials became more elaborate, their clothing more intricate, and their connection to the steppe more pronounced. We see in their graves the presence of wheat and barley, crops that originated in the fertile crescent of the Near East, tucked away in small baskets to feed the soul on its journey through the afterlife. This presence of Western grains alongside the arrival of bronze metallurgy suggests a people who were masters of adaptation. They took the best of what the world offered and wove it into their own unique culture, centered around the life-giving rivers that flowed down from the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountains. There is a certain weight to this realization, the understanding that these people, buried in the middle of a desert in what is now modern China, were walking the earth at the same time the great pyramids were already ancient mysteries to the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, and while the first stones were being raised at Stonehenge, they were not isolated. They were part of the pulse of the planet. When we look at the bronze trinkets found in the folds of their woolen cloaks, we are looking at the evidence of a globalized world in its infancy. It was a world where a discovery in the Ural Mountains could, over the course of a few generations, find its way into the hands of a shepherd grazing his flock near the Lopnor Salt Lake. And yet, for all their technological progress, there is a haunting simplicity to their lives that the bronze cannot mask. The transition from stone to metal did not change the fundamental reality of their existence, the reliance on the water, the fear of the encroaching sand, and the deep spiritual connection to the land. The bronze axes they carried were symbols of status and utility, but they were also anchors in a world that was becoming increasingly complex. As we move through the archaeological record, we see the bronze becoming more refined, the alloys more precise, reflecting a growing mastery over the elements. The heat of the forge and the cooling of the mold became the new rhythm of the basin, a metallic heartbeat thrumming beneath the vast, silent sky. One cannot help but wonder about the conversations that took place around those early Bronze Age fires. Did they speak of the lands to the west, where the mountains were even taller and the grass even greener? Did they tell stories of the great migrations, of the ancestors who first dared to enter the depression of the Tarim? The mummies remain tight-lipped, their secrets preserved by the salt and the dry air, but the bronze remains to speak for them. It tells us of a time when the boundaries of the world were expanding, when the horizon was not a limit but an invitation. The Bronze Age horizon in the Tarim Basin was a period of profound curiosity and quiet strength. It was a time when the human spirit began to test the limits of what was possible, reaching out across the wastes to find others, to trade, to learn, and to survive. As we look at the timeline, from 2000 BCE through the centuries that followed, we see a steady progression toward the world we recognize today. But in these early stages, there is a purity to the discovery, a sense of wonder in the first time a man saw a piece of earth turn into a gleaming golden-brown blade. As the sun of the Bronze Age reached its zenith, the people of the Tarim had already established themselves as the keepers of the gate between worlds. They were the masters of the crossroads, the guardians of the early routes that would one day change the course of history. And as we continue to unearth their resting places, we find that the bronze they left behind has not lost its luster. It still catches the light of our modern world, reflecting back a time when the world was wide, the future was unwritten, and the desert was a place of infinite possibility. The stone tools may have been laid aside, but the journey was only just beginning, a journey that would lead us deeper into the mystery of who these people truly were and why they chose this harsh, beautiful landscape to be their eternal home. Imagine, if you will, a single strand of hair, preserved for 4,000 years in the desiccated silence of the sand. For decades, this hair, often fair, sometimes auburn, or a deep earthy brown, was seen as a biological map leading straight back to the heart of Europe. Looking at the high bridge of a mummy's nose, the deep-set eyes, and the woven tartans that draped their shoulders, it seemed only logical to conclude that these were weary travellers from the far west. Scholars whispered of the Tocharians, an enigmatic branch of the Indo-European family tree who spoke a language more akin to Celtic or Germanic than to the tongues of their closest neighbours. The theory was elegant and simple. A great migration had pushed eastward across the steppes until these pioneers found the turquoise rivers of the Tarim Basin and decided their long journey was finally at an end. But the desert has a way of holding on to its secrets until the very last moment, only to reveal a truth far more complex than our initial guesses. In the year 2021, a massive genomic study sought to finally decode the ancestry of these silent watchers. Scientists carefully extracted genetic material from 13 of the oldest mummies, individuals who had lived between 4,000 and 3,700 years ago. They expected to find the genetic markers of the Yamnaya, the nomadic herders from the Russian steppes, or perhaps the farmers of the Iranian plateau. Instead, the results sent a ripple of quiet astonishment through the halls of archaeology. The mummies were not recent arrivals at all. They were a ghost population, a lineage that had been largely lost to history until the moment their DNA was sequenced. The study revealed that these people were the direct descendants of a group known as the ancient North Eurasians. This was a population that had once roamed the vast icy reaches of Siberia during the last ice age, long before the first civilizations rose from the dust. While this lineage survives today in small percentages within the DNA of indigenous Americans and some northern Europeans, it had largely vanished as a distinct, unmixed group everywhere else in the world. Yet here, in the isolated warmth of the Tarim Basin, this ancient lineage had endured, preserved like an insect in amber. They were not migrants from a distant land, but a local people whose roots in the region stretched back much further than anyone had dared to imagine. As we consider this, a sense of profound isolation begins to settle over the landscape. We often think of the ancient world as a place of constant movement, a restless churning of tribes and cultures, but the genetic data suggests that for over a millennium, the people of the Tarim Basin remained genetically distinct from the population surrounding them. To the north, the steppe herders moved with their wagons and horses. To the west, the farmers of the mountain valleys tilled the soil. Yet the people of the Xiaohe culture did not intermarry with them. They lived in a state of genetic solitude, a biological island surrounded by a sea of shifting peoples. And yet, this is where the mystery deepens into something truly beautiful. While they kept their ancestry pure, they were by no means culturally isolated. They were masters of a sort of ancient cosmopolitanism. They wore woolen garments woven with techniques that mirrored those found in the West, and they cultivated wheat and barley, crops that had originally been domesticated in the fertile crescent of the Near East. They herded cattle and sheep, animals not native to the desert. They were a people who looked outward, embracing the ideas, the technologies, and the flavors of the wider world, all while holding firmly to their own ancestral identity. It challenges our modern notions of what it means to be a migrant or a local. They were both and neither, a unique synthesis of deep local history and wide-ranging global curiosity. There is a certain weight to this discovery, a feeling of looking back into a mirror that has been cracked for thousands of years. We once thought we knew them because they looked like us, or at least like people we recognized from history books. We labeled them Europeans because it was a comfortable category, a way to slot the unknown into the known. But the DNA tells us that they were something far more singular. They were the last remnants of a world that existed before the great divisions of East and West had even been drawn. They represent a time of deep time, a period when the human story was still being written in small, isolated pockets of the earth, each group developing its own way of surviving in the shadow of the mountains. As the wind sighs over the dunes of the Taklamakan, it is easy to imagine these people sitting by their fires, looking up at the same stars we see tonight. They would have known the exact curve of the horizon, the way the light changes just before a sandstorm, and the sound of the river as it swelled with the spring melt. They were not strangers passing through. They were the masters of this land. The migrant theory, while romantic in its vision of long-distance treks and clashing cultures, falls away in the face of this older, more grounded truth. They belong to the desert, and the desert, in its own way, belonged to them. We must also consider the concept of the younger Dryas, that brief, cold snap in the Earth's history that occurred some 12,000 years ago. It was a time of great upheaval, when the climate shifted violently, and many ancient populations were forced to move or perish. It is possible that the ancestors of the Tarim mummies found refuge in these basins during those harsh millennia, carving out a life in the sheltered valleys while the rest of the world struggled to adapt. By the time they were laying their dead in the boat-shaped coffins at Xiaohe, they were already the heirs to thousands of years of survival. Their presence in the basin wasn't a sudden arrival, but a long, slow flowering of a culture that had learned to dance with the extremes of the environment. The genetic isolation found in the mummies is a reminder of how little we truly understand about the movements of our ancestors. We often rely on pottery shards and bronze daggers to tell the story, but those are merely the things people carried. The DNA is the story of the people themselves. To find such a pure ancient lineage persisting so late into the Bronze Age is a rarity in the archaeological record. It suggests a society that was deeply conservative in its social structures, perhaps valuing their specific heritage as a vital part of their survival in the harsh wilderness. They knew who they were, and they seemingly saw no need to change that, even as they adopted the best of what their neighbors had to offer. In this light, the mummies become even more enigmatic. They are not a lost tribe of Europeans who wandered too far from home. They are a testament to the endurance of a much older world, a world of the ancient North Eurasians that has otherwise vanished into the mist. When we look into their faces now, we aren't looking at them, the outsiders, but at a unique branch of the human family that flourished in silence and solitude. The desert did more than just preserve their bodies. It served as a sanctuary for a lineage that the rest of the world had forgotten. As we move forward in our journey through the sands, the questions continue to hum in the air like the distant sound of a cicada. If they were so genetically isolated, how did they learn the complex weaving patterns of the West? Who brought them the first grains of wheat, and what did they trade in return? The DNA has given us a map of their blood, but it cannot tell us the stories they told their children, or the songs they sang as they gathered the desert's bounty. The mystery of their origin has been solved, only to be replaced by a deeper mystery of their daily lives, a life of quiet persistence at the edges of the known world. The soft, rhythmic sound of a stone pestle grinding against a mortar echoed across the salt flats long before the first silk caravans ever dreamed of crossing the Taklamakan. A steady, patient pulse that defined the rhythm of survival in a land that should have been empty. To understand the Tarim mummies, we must look past their striking faces and woven shrouds and look instead at the ground beneath their feet, for their existence was a triumph of geography over impossibility. They did not merely wander this wasteland, they mastered it, turning the parched fringes of the desert into a string of emerald-colored sanctuaries. Life in the Tarim Basin was a delicate negotiation with the elements, a pact signed in the shadow of the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountains. These towering peaks, capped with eternal ice, acted as the great water towers of the region. As the seasons turned and the summer warmth crept up the slopes, the glaciers would weep, sending torrents of meltwater rushing down into the basin. This seasonal gift formed the Tarim River and its many wandering tributaries, veins of life that pulsed with silver water for a few precious months each year. The people of the oasis did not wait for the rain almost never came. Instead, they watched the mountains. They learned to capture this fleeting runoff, guiding it through hand-dug channels into the thirsty soil, creating a miniature world of green amidst a sea of shifting yellow sand. In these sheltered pockets of earth, they planted the seeds of a distant heritage. While the surrounding world was often in flux, the farmers of the Tarim were quietly cultivating wheat and barley, grains that had travelled thousands of miles from the Fertile Crescent to find a home in the heart of Asia. It is a strange and beautiful image to consider. These people, with their Western features, standing in fields of golden grain that mirrored the harvests of the Mediterranean, thousands of miles from any ocean. They were among the first to bring these crops to the East, acting as the silent heralds of a botanical revolution that would eventually change the face of China. As they sowed their fields, they also tended to their livestock, moving their sheep and goats between the riverside pastures and the scrublands of the desert edge. Theirs was a mixed economy, a balanced life of the settled farmer and the mobile herder, a strategy that ensured that if the crops failed, the herds would provide, and if the herds dwindled, the silos would remain full. But the desert is a jealous guardian of its secrets, and it demands a high price for the water it yields. The soil here is often brackish, heavy with salts that rise to the surface as the water evaporates in the blistering heat. To survive here for centuries, as these people did, required a profound understanding of irrigation and soil management, a form of ancient engineering that was passed down through the generations, whispered from father to daughter as they walked the narrow banks of the canals. They lived in the constant presence of deep time, aware that their oases were fragile islands in an ocean of sand that was always trying to reclaim them. Perhaps the most intimate glimpse into their daily lives comes not from the grand scale of their irrigation works, but from a small, humble discovery found resting against the skin of the mummies themselves. In the cemetery of Xiaohe, archaeologists found something truly remarkable. Small organic clumps of a yellowish substance, often strung on necklaces or placed in gourds near the bodies of the deceased. Scientific analysis, using the precision of modern proteomics, revealed that these were not stones or beads, but crumbs of the world's oldest known cheese. Imagine the scene 4,000 years ago. A mother preparing a meal in the shade of a poplar tree, using a combination of milk and a specific type of bacteria and yeast known as kefir. This was not the cheese we might find on a modern table, but a probiotic fermented curd, light and slightly sour, designed to be portable and long-lasting. By wearing it or carrying it into the grave, they were signaling its vital importance to their way of life. It was a concentrated form of the sun's energy, captured by the grass, processed by their herds, and transformed by human ingenuity into a food that could sustain them through the leanest winters. The presence of this cheese tells us that they were masters of fermentation, a complex biological process that allowed them to store the bounty of their animals without the need for refrigeration. It was a technology of survival as essential to their lives as the bronze of their tools or the wool of their coats. As we look at these ancient remnants, we see a people who are deeply connected to the chemistry of the natural world. They knew which microbes would turn milk into life-sustaining curd, and they knew which mountain streams would bring the most fertile silt to their fields. This was the Oasis Economy, a sophisticated, interconnected system that relied on the precise timing of the seasons and the careful management of every drop of moisture. They lived in a state of constant vigilance, yet their burials reflect a sense of peace and abundance. They were buried with baskets overflowing with grain, with joints of meat, and with those precious crumbles of cheese, as if to ensure that even in the great silence of the afterlife, the hospitality of the oasis would never end. The silence of the desert today masks what must have been a vibrant sensory world. The air would have carried the scent of damp earth and ripening grain, the bleating of lambs, and the rhythmic splashing of water being lifted from the canals. It was a landscape of sound and smell that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, wind-whipped dunes just a few hundred yards away. The transition from the lush green of the barley fields to the absolute desolation of the sand was likely as sharp as a knife's edge. In this narrow margin, between the water and the waste, they built a civilization that endured for over 1,000 years, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with the infinite indifference of the desert. One cannot help but wonder how they felt as they looked toward the horizon, seeing the shimmering heat waves dance over the salt flats. Did they feel like masters of their domain, or like guests who were only permitted to stay as long as the mountains continued to melt? The archaeology suggests a people who were profoundly settled, who invested deeply in their land and their dead, weaving their identity into the very soil they irrigated. They were the keepers of the green fire, tending the flames of life in a place where light and heat usually meant death. And as the centuries passed, their techniques became more refined, their oases more stable, until it seemed as though they had conquered the Taklamakan itself. But the desert is patient, and its memory is long. It waits for the rivers to shift, for the glaciers to recede, and for the hand of the farmer to falter. For now, however, we see them in their prime, a people of the grain and the herd, wearing their cheese like jewels, standing defiant against the drifting sands of time. Deep within the dusty archives of the early 20th century, a different kind of treasure began to emerge from the sand-choked ruins of the Tarim Basin. not of gold or jade, but of fragile brittle paper and birch bark. While the mummies themselves sat in a silence that had lasted thousands of years, these manuscripts began to whisper. They were written in a script that seemed familiar at first glance, a derivative of the Indian Brahmi, but the words they formed were utterly alien to the region. As linguists began the painstaking process of deciphering these fragments, they realized they were looking at a ghost, a language that should not have existed 5,000 miles away from the green valleys of Europe. They called it Tocharian. It is a name borrowed from ancient Greek accounts of a people called the Tocharoi, though we may never know what these desert dwellers truly called themselves. As the scholars untangled the grammar and the syntax, a profound mystery began to take shape. In the world of linguistics, Indo-European languages are generally divided into two great families: the Sartum group, which includes the languages of India, Iran, and Eastern Europe, and the Tentum group, which encompasses the Celtic, Germanic, and Italic tongues of the West. Based on geography alone, any ancient language found in the heart of Central Asia should have belonged to the Satum branch. And yet, Tocharian was defiantly, stubbornly Centum. The word for 100 in these manuscripts was not shatam, as it is in Sanskrit, or sato, as it is in Old Slavonic. It was kent in one dialect and kante in another. It echoed the Latin centum and the English 100. The word for mother was macher. The word for father was pacher. To hear these words spoken in the dry heat of a Taklamakan oasis would have felt like a glitch in the timeline of human migration. It was as if a piece of the Atlantic coast had been picked up and dropped into the shadow of the celestial mountains. The linguistic evidence suggested that the ancestors of the people who wrote these texts had separated from the main Indo-European trunk in the extremely distant past, perhaps even before the Greeks or the Romans had fully formed their own identities. As the years passed and more fragments were recovered from the caves of the northern Silk Road, researchers identified two distinct dialects, which they labelled simply as Tocharian A and Tocharian B. Tocharian A, or Agnian, seemed to be a liturgical language, a frozen sacred tongue used primarily for Buddhist scriptures and rituals. Tocharian B, or Caucasian, was more vibrant and alive, found in everything from monastery accounts and medical treatises to love poems and graffiti. It was the everyday speech of a sophisticated, literate society that flourished long after the earliest mummies had been laid to rest in their boat-shaped coffins. This realization created a bridge across the millennia. It suggested that the fair-haired, tall-statured individuals found at sites like Cherchen and Xiaohe were not merely a wandering band that vanished into the dunes, but were the precursors to a great, enduring civilization. By the middle of the first millennium, the descendants of the Tarim mummies had built magnificent city-states like Kucha and Turpan. These were the legendary Buddhist kingdoms of the Silk Road, places of high culture where East and West did more than just trade. They merged. Imagine for a moment the sensory world of a Tocharian city in the year 500. The air is thick with the scent of sandalwood incense and the sound of bells ringing from the eaves of gilded stupas. In the marketplaces, traders from the Tang dynasty of China haggle with merchants from the Byzantine Empire. And amidst this cosmopolitan swirl, the local royalty, men and women who still bore the high-bridged noses and light eyes of their ancestors, listened to monks chanting in a language that sounded more like the forests of Germany or the hills of Ireland than the plains of the Ganges. The manuscripts tell us of a people who were deeply spiritual, obsessed with the nuances of karma and the transience of life. They translated the great works of Indian philosophy into their own centum tongue, creating a unique synthesis of thought. But even as they built their libraries and painted their vibrant frescoes in the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas, The desert was reclaiming the land. The rivers that fed their oases were shrinking, retreating back toward the melting glaciers. The very environment that had preserved their ancestors' bodies for thousands of years was now making it impossible for the living to remain. The linguistic puzzle of Tocharian challenges everything we thought we knew about the great migration of peoples. For decades, the standard narrative suggested a slow outward ripple from a central homeland. But the presence of a Western-style language so far to the east suggests a more chaotic, more adventurous history. A story of a group that perhaps broke away early and travelled further and faster than any of their kin, crossing the vast steppes and the high mountain passes to find a home in the most unlikely of places. We are left to wonder if the people who wrote these manuscripts looked back at the ancient mummies they occasionally found in the shifting sands and recognized them as their own. Did they see the woolen tartans and the felt hats and feel a tug of ancestral memory? Or had the passage of 2,000 years erased the connection, leaving the mummies as much a mystery to the Tocharian kings as they were to the 20th century explorers who finally brought them to the world's attention? The words on the page and the bodies in the sand are two halves of a single broken mirror. The mummies give us the physical reality, the DNA, the clothing, the facial features, while the Tocharian language gives us the mind and the soul of the culture that followed. Together, they suggest a lost branch of the human family tree that reached out into the void of the Central Asian deserts and bloomed in the most brilliant, unexpected colors. As the sun sets over the ruins of Kucha, the wind still whistles through the empty archways, sounding almost like the vowels of a language that refused to be forgotten, a language that traveled across the world only to be buried in silence, waiting for us to learn its name once more. The transition from the prehistoric nomads to the literate Buddhist monks was not a sudden leap, but a slow, rhythmic evolution shaped by the unique geography of the basin. The Taklamakan did more than just isolate these people. It acted as a giant filter, allowing only the most resilient ideas and the most adaptable people to survive. As the Tocharian language evolved from its ancient roots into the sophisticated dialects of the Silk Road era, it carried with it the echoes of a prehistoric world, a world where the boundaries between Europe and Asia were not lines on a map, but fluid, shifting horizons. And so, the mystery of the language remains one of the most compelling chapters in the story of the Tarim Basin. It serves as a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting to be read. Each scrap of Tocharian text is a bridge built across deep time, connecting the modern scholar to a monk in a desert cell, and that monk to a prehistoric wanderer who first saw the snow-capped peaks of the Kunlun Mountains and decided to call this strange, beautiful, and unforgiving land home. The scent of burning ephedra once drifted through the air of the Xiaohe cemetery, a sharp and medicinal fragrance that cut through the dry heat of the desert afternoon. It is a smell that lingers in the imagination even now, thousands of years after the last mourner departed the dunes. To step into the spiritual world of the Tarim people is to enter a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead were as thin as a veil of silk, and where every ritual was a calculated attempt to navigate the mysteries of the great beyond. As we look upon the burial grounds of Xiaohe, we are struck first by the strange and haunting geometry of the graves. These people did not bury their dead in rectangular boxes or stone vaults. Instead, they placed them within boat-shaped coffins, constructed from massive planks of poplar wood that had been carved and fitted with meticulous care. But there is a peculiar detail that catches the eye of the modern observer. These boats were buried upside down. It is as if the mourners were not merely laying a body to rest, but were launching a vessel into an invisible sea. In the logic of their faith, perhaps the earth itself was a vast ocean, and the deceased required a sturdy hull to navigate the currents of the underworld. By inverting the boat, they may have been creating a dry, protected pocket within the sand, a symbolic air bubble for the soul to inhabit as it began its long journey toward the stars. The cemetery at Xiaohe is a forest of wooden poles, hundreds of them, rising from the dunes like the masts of a ghost fleet. These are not mere markers, but deeply symbolic pillars that speak to the fundamental forces of life and creation. Upon closer inspection, archaeologists realized that the poles were shaped into distinct forms. Some were massive, oar-like paddles, while others were tall, slender columns, painted in vibrant shades of red. These represent phallic and vulvar symbols, a bold and unapologetic celebration of fertility and the dual nature of existence. In a harsh environment where life was fragile and the desert was always encroaching, the act of burial was transformed into an act of procreation. They were planting the seeds of the next generation in the very soil that claimed the previous one, ensuring that the cycle of life would remain unbroken despite the cold finality of death. The orientation of the bodies further reveals their celestial preoccupations. Almost universally, the mummies of the Tarim Basin were laid to rest with their heads pointing toward the east. This was no accidental alignment. They watched for the sunrise, waiting for the first light of daybreak to touch their faces, even in the eternal darkness of the grave. It suggests a belief in a solar afterlife, a conviction that the sun, which died every evening and was reborn every morning, served as the ultimate guide for the wandering spirit. They viewed time not as a straight line leading toward an end, but as a great wheel, a path that would eventually bring them back to the light. Within the folds of their woolen shrouds, we find the remnants of their sacred medicine. Small leather pouches containing dried twigs of ephedra have been discovered tucked beside the bodies, along with traces of cannabis and other psychoactive plants. These were more than just offerings. They were the tools of the shaman. Ephedra, a plant known for its stimulating properties and its ability to clear the respiratory system, may have been used in rituals to induce a state of heightened awareness, allowing the living to communicate with the ancestors. The presence of these substances hints at a complex shamanistic tradition, one where the priest or healer acted as a bridge between the physical world and the spirit realm. They likely sang songs that have since been lost to the wind, and performed dances in the flickering light of campfires, calling upon the spirits of the mountains and the desert to protect the community. As the years passed, the rituals became more elaborate, yet they always retained a sense of deep intimacy. The mourners would often place small hand-carved wooden figurines beside the deceased, tiny representations of people that may have been intended to serve as companions or guardians in the afterlife. Some mummies were found with masks of painted wood or leather, their features frozen in a perpetual expression of calm or surprise. These masks were not intended for the living to see, but for the gods, a way of presenting a perfected version of the self to the powers that govern the universe. The preservation of these sites is a miracle of stratigraphy, the layering of earth and time that protects the secrets of the past. Because the Tarim Basin is one of the driest places on earth, the moisture that would normally cause decay was absent, allowing the organic materials of their spiritual life to survive. We can still see the intricate weaves of their baskets, the delicate feathers tied to their hats, and even the remains of the last meals they shared with their loved ones. It is a hauntingly domestic view of the sacred. To them, the afterlife was not a distant, abstract concept, but a continuation of the life they knew, a place where they would still need their warm coats, their sturdy boots, and the medicinal herbs that had sustained them in the world of the sun. We must wonder what these people thought as they stood upon the high dunes, looking out over the vast, shimmering heat of the Taklamakan. Did they see the desert as a prison or as a holy sanctuary? The effort they put into their burials suggests a profound respect for the land and a belief that they were part of a larger, cosmic order. They did not fear the deep time that stretched out before them. Instead, they prepared for it. They built their boats, they gathered their herbs, and they turned their faces to the east, waiting for a dawn that they were certain would come. In the silence of the cemetery, one can almost hear the echoes of their prayers, carried on the same winds that eventually buried their monuments in sand. The upside-down boats and the towering wooden pillars stand as a testament to a civilization that found meaning in the most unforgiving of landscapes. They were a people who understood that though the body is temporary, the stories we tell and the rituals we perform can endure for millennia, waiting for a future age to uncover them and marvel at the persistence of the human spirit. As we contemplate these ancient customs, we are reminded that archaeology is more than just the study of bones and pottery. It is the study of hope. Every object placed in a grave is a message sent into the future, a plea to be remembered and a declaration of faith in something greater than ourselves. The Tarim mummies, with their serene faces and their carefully prepared vessels, continue to sail through the sea of time, carrying the spiritual legacy of a lost world into our own. They remind us that even in the heart of the desert, life finds a way to flourish, and even in the face of death, the human heart never stops searching for the light. To understand the origins of these desert wanderers, we must cast our gaze away from the shifting sands of the Taklamakan and look toward the north, toward the vast, undulating emerald sea of the Eurasian steppe. It is here, amidst the whistling winds and the endless horizon, that the story of the Tarim mummies finds its ancestral echo. As the third millennium before the Common Era dawned, a profound movement of people began to ripple across the landscape. These were the pastoralists, the herders of cattle and sheep who lived in a state of constant, rhythmic motion. Among them were the people of the Afanasievo culture, a group that remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing enigmas. They were a people of the mountains and the plains, settling in the Altai and Sayan ranges, thousands of miles away from the established cradles of civilization in Mesopotamia or Egypt. When we look at the physical remains of the Afanasievo, we see a striking resemblance to the tall, robust figures found in the Tarim Basin. The shape of the skull, the bridge of the nose, the very stature of the individuals suggests a deep biological kinship that transcends the vast distances of the ancient world. The migration of these early pastoralists was not a singular event, but a slow generational drift, a gradual expansion driven by the need for fresh pasture and the innate human desire to see what lies beyond the next ridge. As the centuries unfolded, these groups navigated the treacherous passes of the Altai Mountains, moving southward with their flocks and their families. They carried with them more than just their livestock. They brought a complex package of technologies and traditions that would eventually transform the heart of Asia. Among these was the mastery of the horse, a creature that would redefine the boundaries of the known world. In the quiet of the steppe, the bond between human and animal grew into something sacred, a partnership that allowed for the rapid transit of ideas and goods across distances that were previously unthinkable. Along with the horse came the chariot, a marvel of ancient engineering featuring spoked wheels and lightweight frames that allowed for swift movement across the open plains. We see the influence of this technology in the later Andronovo culture, which succeeded the Afanasievo and spread its influence even further afield. The Andronovo were a people of the Bronze Age, and their metallurgical skills were unmatched in their time. They forged weapons and ornaments with a precision that speaks to a highly organized and specialized society. As they pushed toward the fringes of the Tarim Basin, they encountered a landscape that was both inviting and formidable. The basin, with its ring of high mountains and its central drying core, acted as a sort of gravitational well for these migrating populations. Scholars often describe the Tarim Basin as a genetic cul-de-sac, a place where ancient lineages, once part of a vast and interconnected web of movement, became isolated and preserved by the unique geography of the region. While the rest of the world continued to churn and mix, the populations within the basin remained relatively stable, their genetic signatures locked in time like insects in amber. This isolation is what allowed the distinctive features of the Tarim mummies to persist for so long, creating a biological time capsule that challenges our understanding of how ancient peoples moved and settled. Imagine, if you will, a small group of herders descending from the cold, thin air of the mountain passes into the sheltered valleys of the northern Tarim. They bring with them the memories of the steppe, the songs of the open wind and the stories of ancestors who lived under a different sky. They find the oases fed by the melting snows of the Kunlun and the Tian Shan, and they recognize a place where life can be sustained. Over generations, the nomadic life of the steppe begins to soften into a more settled existence. They build homes of mud brick and timber, they plant wheat and barley brought from the west, and they continue to weave the intricate textiles that would one day clothe their bodies in the silence of the grave. Yet, even as they adapted to the desert, they remained connected to the broader world through the subtle threads of trade and shared technology. The bronze pins, the stone beads, and the specific styles of pottery found in the Tarim graves all whisper of a heritage that reaches back to the great cultures of the north. The presence of these Western-looking people so far east has long been a source of quiet wonder. It suggests that the ancient world was far more fluid and interconnected than we often dare to imagine. The borders we draw on maps today had no meaning to the pastoralists of 4,000 years ago. To them, the world was defined by the quality of the grass, the availability of water, and the strength of the seasonal winds. The migration patterns were governed by the seasons and the needs of the herd, creating a slow-motion dance across the continent. As we study the DNA of the Tarim mummies, we find traces of these northern steppe ancestors, but we also find something more complex, a mosaic of influences that suggests the basin was not just a destination, but a meeting place. Even in a genetic cul-de-sac, the ripples of the outside world eventually find their way in. As the years passed and the climate of the region began its long, slow descent into aridity, the people of the Tarim held fast to their traditions. The chariots and horses that had brought their ancestors across the mountains became symbols of status and spiritual power, even as the landscape became less suited for the wide-ranging life of the steppe. We find evidence of this in the burial rites, where the horse is often given a place of honor, reflecting a deep-seated cultural memory of the plains. The transition from the wide open spaces of the Andronovo world to the confined oases of the Tarim must have been a profound shift in the human experience, a narrowing of horizons that led to a deepening of internal culture. In the stillness of the desert, these people refined their crafts and honored their dead with a level of detail that speaks to a society that had found peace in its isolation. The connection between the Tarim and the northern steppe cultures serves as a bridge across the vastness of deep time. It reminds us that every population is a traveler, and every culture is a collection of borrowed ideas and inherited wisdom. The mummies, with their woolen cloaks and their bronze tools, are the physical manifestation of a journey that began thousands of miles away and thousands of years ago. They stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and its ability to flourish in the most unexpected of places. As we contemplate the relationship between the Afanasievo, the Andronovo, and the people of the Tarim, we are forced to reconsider the narrative of human history. It is not a story of isolated pockets of civilization developing in a vacuum, but a grand, sweeping epic of movement, adaptation, and survival. The desert may have claimed their cities and their names, but the evidence of their journey remains etched in their bones and woven into the very fabric of their clothes. We are left to wonder how many other lost branches of the human family tree are waiting to be discovered, hidden in the remote corners of the world, preserved by the same forces that kept the Tarim mummies secret for so many millennia. The more we learn, the more we realize that the past is a vast and intricate tapestry, and we have only just begun to untangle the first few threads. The desert wind carries a scent of salt and ancient dust, a reminder that this parched landscape was once home to shimmering lakes and vibrant marshlands. As the centuries drifted by, the isolation of the Tarim Basin began to dissolve, not through a sudden upheaval, but through the slow, rhythmic tread of camel hooves and the steady pulse of expanding empires. To the east, the Han dynasty was stretching its long reach toward the setting sun, seeking horses, allies, and the promise of influence. As the Chinese emissaries moved westward, they encountered a world that must have seemed like a waking dream, a series of lush oases inhabited by people who looked nothing like the farmers of the Yellow River Valley. These were the descendants of the early mummies, the keepers of a legacy that had already endured for 2,000 years. And now their quiet world was becoming the vital bridge between the rising powers of the East and the distant, unknown lands of the West. The transformation of the region was a gradual unfolding of maps and mines. The Han emperors, driven by a desire to secure their borders and find the legendary heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley, sent explorers like Zhang Qian into the vast unknown. What they found was not a void, but a sophisticated network of city-states, each a jewel of green set within the golden sands. The interaction between these indigenous Tarim people and the Chinese emissaries was a meeting of two different worlds, a collision of cultures that would eventually weave the first strands of the Silk Road. It was a time of cautious observation and quiet diplomacy, where the exchange of a silk bolt or a jade carving carried the weight of a new era. The Chinese chronicles began to fill with descriptions of these western regions, noting the high bridges of the nose, the deep-set eyes, and the thick beards of the people they met, features that mirrored the silent faces of the mummies resting beneath the dunes. At the heart of this changing world sat the kingdom of Lulan, a pivotal hub that functioned as the gateway to the desert. Imagine a city where the air is filled with the murmur of a dozen different tongues and the smell of exotic spices mingling with the scent of the nearby Lopnor Lake. Lulan was more than just a stop on a map. It was a sanctuary for the weary traveller and a bustling marketplace for the ambitious merchant. Here, the European features of the local population persisted well into the early centuries of the Common Era, a testament to the enduring genetic heritage of the original settlers. Through the study of stratigraphy, the science of reading the layers of the earth like the pages of a book, archaeologists have traced the growth of Lulan from a modest settlement into a grand administrative centre. The layers reveal a story of adaptation as the people of Lulan learned to harness the shifting waters of the Tarim River to sustain their orchards and their dreams. As the years passed, the influence of the Han dynasty deepened, and the lowland kingdom found itself caught in a delicate dance between the imperial ambitions of China and the nomadic powers of the north. The indigenous people, with their woven woolens and their ancient traditions, began to incorporate the luxuries of the East into their daily lives. We see this in the burials from this period, graves where Roman glass sits alongside Chinese silks, and where the deceased are adorned with jewelry that reflects a fusion of styles from across the continent. Yet, despite this influx of foreign goods, the physical appearance of the people remained remarkably consistent. The high cheekbones and light-coloured hair that had characterized the very first pioneers in the basin were still present, centuries after the first contact with the Han. It is as if the desert itself was acting as a reservoir, holding on to these ancient lineages even as the world around them was being reshaped by the currents of global trade. The Silk Road was never a single path, but a shifting web of routes that breathed life into the desert. In the shadow of the Kunlun Mountains, the caravans moved with a patient, measured pace, carrying the weight of empires on their backs. The interaction between the Chinese officials and the local leaders was a complex tapestry of tribute and trade. We can almost see the scene. A Chinese governor, dressed in robes of fine crimson silk, sitting across from a Lulan chieftain who wears a tunic of heavy patterned wool, much like the fabric found in the tombs of the Beauty of Lulan. They speak through interpreters, negotiating the rights to water, the safety of the roads, and the taxes on the precious cargo passing through the gates. In these moments, the deep time of the Tarim Basin met the rising tide of history, and the secrets of the mummies became intertwined with the destiny of the world. There is a profound sense of mystery in how these features survived for so long in such a crossroads of humanity. One might expect that the constant movement of people would have quickly blurred the distinct physical characteristics of the Tarim inhabitants, and yet the biological evidence suggests a remarkable degree of continuity. These were a people who were deeply rooted in their landscape, even as they welcomed the rest of the world to their doorsteps. They were the silent witnesses to the birth of the greatest trade network in human history, the quiet guardians of a corridor that linked the Mediterranean to the Pacific. As we look at the artifacts of this era, the wooden slips covered in elegant Chinese calligraphy, the fragments of Greek-inspired tapestries, and the sturdy, locally made pottery, we see a civilization that was comfortable in its own skin, even as it embraced the new. The role of Lulan as a trade hub meant that it was also a place of cultural alchemy. It was here that ideas about religion, art, and governance were exchanged as freely as coins. The indigenous Tarim people, with their ancient roots stretching back to the Bronze Age, became the facilitators of this exchange. They were the guides who knew the hidden springs, the linguists who could bridge the gap between East and West, and the craftsmen who blended diverse influences into a unique local aesthetic. The persistence of their European features into the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era serves as a physical reminder of their long journey. It suggests that while they were part of a vast international network, they remained a distinct community, a branch of the human family that had found a home in the most unlikely of places and refused to be erased by the passage of time. As the sun sets over the ruins of Lulan today, the shadows stretch long and thin across the salt flats, mimicking the silhouettes of the caravans that once passed this way. The city is now a ghost, reclaimed by the desert that once gave it life, its wooden beams bleached white by the sun, and its walls eroded by the relentless wind. But in the silence of the wasteland, the legacy of the Silk Road remains. We are left to ponder the lives of those who walked these streets, the mothers who sang to their children in tongues now forgotten, the merchants who dreamed of distant cities, and the emissaries who looked into the eyes of the Tarim people and saw a reflection of a world they did not yet understand. The rise of the Silk Road was not just a story of commerce, it was a story of human connection, a moment when the hidden secrets of the Tarim mummies were briefly illuminated by the torchlight of history. The more we explore these ancient layers, the more we realize that our understanding of the past is often limited by the boundaries we draw today. The people of the Tarim Basin did not see themselves as Europeans in China. They were simply the people of the oases, the inhabitants of a land that was the center of their own universe. The arrival of the Han dynasty and the opening of the Silk Road were merely the latest chapters in a story that had been unfolding for millennia. As we continue to untangle the threads of their existence, we find that the tapestry of human history is far more vibrant and interconnected than we ever dared to imagine. A vast, swirling pattern of movement and stillness, of ancient bones and shimmering silk, all preserved in the patient, cooling embrace of the desert sands. The wind, when it speaks across the Taklamakan, carries a dry, rasping song, a sound that seems to lament the slow, rhythmic departure of water from a land that once breathed with the humidity of life. For centuries, the people of the Tarim Basin had lived in a delicate, shimmering balance with the elements, building their lives around the silver veins of rivers that flowed down from the icy heights of the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountains. But as the first millennium of the Common Era progressed, a quiet, inexorable change began to settle over the earth. It was not a sudden catastrophe, not a wall of fire or a great flood, but rather a slow, parching breath that whispered through the reeds and over the surfaces of the great lakes. At the heart of this transformation lay the Lop Nur lake system, once a vast and wandering expanse of blue that acted as the lifeblood of the eastern basin. It was a terminal lake, a place where rivers ended their long journeys, spreading out into marshes and lagoons that teemed with waterfowl and supported lush forests of poplar and tamarisk. To the ancients, it was the salt sea, a destination for traders and a sanctuary for the weary. Yet the climate of the world was shifting, whether through subtle fluctuations in the Earth's tilt or broader patterns of atmospheric cooling and warming. The glaciers in the high mountains began to retreat, and the seasonal meltwater that fed the basin grew thin and unreliable. The lake, which had shifted its position across the desert floor for thousands of years, like a restless sleeper, began to shrink. The reeds withered, the fish vanished into the deepening salt crust, and the once vibrant green fringes of the water turned to the color of bone and dust. As the water retreated, the great oasis cities, those jewels of the Silk Road, found themselves stranded in a sea of encroaching sand. We look today at the ruins of Nia, a city that once flourished on the southern edge of the desert, and we see a ghost of wood and clay. In its prime, Nia was a place of vineyards and orchards, where the sound of running water in irrigation canals provided a constant, soothing backdrop to the bustle of the marketplace. Archaeologists, digging through the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that act as a timeline of human occupation, have found evidence of a sudden yet strangely orderly departure. They find rooms where the hearths are cold, but the pots remain on the shelves, and documents written on wooden tablets lie scattered as if dropped in a moment of quiet realization. The desert did not conquer Nia with a single storm. It simply made life impossible. When the wells ran dry and the vines turned to brittle sticks, the people gathered what they could carry and walked away, leaving their homes to be swallowed by the dunes. The same fate befell Lulan, the fabled kingdom of the sand situated near the drying shores of Lop Nur. Lulan had been a vital gateway, a point where the northern and southern routes of the Silk Road converged. It was a place of diverse tongues and exotic goods, where the Tocharian speakers met with Han officials and Sogdian merchants. But as the lake receded and the river channels shifted their course, the very geography of survival was rewritten. The life-giving water moved miles away from the city walls, and the heat of the sun became a heavy, oppressive weight. The political instability of the era, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the constant friction between the nomadic tribes of the north and the settled empires of the east only accelerated the decline. Trade routes, once steady and predictable, began to divert to more hospitable lands. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a shifting web, and as the oases of the Tarim grew parched, the web was rewoven elsewhere, leaving the cities of the basin to be forgotten by the world of commerce. In these quiet, abandoned spaces, we find a profound sense of deep time, the realization that even the most sophisticated civilizations are ultimately guests of the environment. The Tocharians, those descendants of the ancient, red-haired mummies who had inhabited this land for nearly 2,000 years, were facing the twilight of their distinct identity. As their cities crumbled and their fields were reclaimed by the desert, they were forced into a new kind of movement. They were no longer the masters of a vast, interconnected network of oases, but a people in transition, drifting toward the edges of the basin where water still flowed, or merging with the new waves of humanity that were washing over the region. By the 8th and 9th centuries, a new cultural force was rising. The Uyghur Khaganate and other Turkic-speaking groups who were moving southward from the Mongolian steppes. These newcomers were hardy, adaptable, and possessed of a powerful military and political structure. As the Tocharian speakers and the Turkic populations began to live side by side, a process of assimilation began, a slow, gentle blending of bloodlines, languages, and traditions. The Tocharian languages, those unique Indo-European tongues that had survived for so long in isolation, began to fade from the marketplace and the home. They were replaced by the rolling cadences of Turkic dialects, which were better suited to the new political realities of the Central Asian plains. Yet this was not a disappearance in the sense of an ending, but rather a transformation. The people did not vanish, they changed. The genetic legacy of the Tarim Mummies, those ancient travelers from the West, did not evaporate into the desert air. Instead, it flowed into the veins of the modern inhabitants of the region. Even today, one can see the echoes of the ancient past in the faces of the people who live along the edges of the Taklamakan, in the occasional flash of light-colored eyes, the high bridge of a nose, or the specific hue of hair that recalls the weavers of the Bronze Age. The Tocharians were not wiped away, they were absorbed, their stories folded into the larger, more complex narrative of the Silk Road. As we contemplate this slow fading of a culture, we are left with the haunting beauty of what remains. The desert, in its arid indifference, has acted as a guardian of memory. Because the water left, the mummies stayed. Because the cities were abandoned to the sand, their wooden beams and delicate silks were not recycled or destroyed by later generations, but were held in a dry, sterile embrace for over 1,000 years. The abandonment of Nia and Lulan was a tragedy for those who lived there, but for us it is a window into a lost world, a chance to touch the fabric of a life that was once as vibrant and certain as our own. We are forced to ask ourselves, how much of our own history is currently being written in water? How many of our own great centers of life depend on the delicate balance of a climate that we often take for granted? The Tarim Basin teaches us that the earth is ever shifting, and that the path of human progress is often dictated by the quiet movement of a river or the drying of a lake. The Tocharians lived through the end of their world, watching as the green horizons of their youth turned to the endless, shimmering yellow of the dunes. They left behind their dead, their clothes, and their silent wooden tablets, perhaps hoping that someone, in a distant and much wetter future, might find them and remember their names. And so, the silence of the Taklamakan is not a void, but a presence, a heavy, layered stillness that contains the echoes of 1,000 years of conversation. The Tocharian language may no longer be spoken, but its ghost lingers in the manuscripts found in hidden caves, waiting for linguists to breathe life into its vowels once more. The irrigation channels may be filled with sand, but their patterns are still visible from high above, tracing the outlines of a dream that refused to die until the very last drop of water had vanished. As the cool night air of the desert settles over the ruins, we feel the weight of these forgotten ages, the patient, enduring legacy of a people who found a home in the most unlikely of places and who remain with us still, preserved in the golden, shifting heart of the world. The sound of a brush against silk is a whisper that has echoed through the laboratories of Urumqi for decades, a soft rhythmic scraping that peels back the layers of dust to reveal the faces of the deep past. To find these people is one thing, but to keep them from crumbling into the very air they now inhabit is a task of immense patience and delicate science. The desert is a jealous guardian. It preserves through desiccation, locking moisture away in the salt and the heat. But the moment a tomb is opened, the balance is shattered. The Xinjiang Archaeological Institute stands as the modern sentinel for these ancient travelers, acting as a bridge between the harsh, shifting reality of the Taklamakan and the sterile, quiet halls of modern preservation. Here, the work is slow, a meditation on the fragility of human memory and the stubbornness of physical form. The challenges beginning at the dig site itself are often overwhelming. The Taklamakan is a landscape in constant motion where a dune that stands 50 feet high one morning may be swept away by a seasonal storm by the next, revealing a coffin or burying a trench under tons of suffocating grit. Working in these conditions requires a specific kind of fortitude, a willingness to battle the wind while maintaining the precision of a surgeon. Archaeologists must often build temporary shelters against the scouring sand, racing against the elements to document the stratigraphy, that is, the layered history of the earth, before the context of a find is lost forever. Every bead, every scrap of woven wool, and every grain of wheat found beside a mummy tells a story, but only if its exact position in the soil is recorded. Without that context, the objects are merely curiosities. With it, they are data points in a vast, unfolding map of human migration. Once moved from the silence of the dunes to the care of the Institute, the mummies undergo a transformation through the lens of modern technology. We no longer rely solely on what the naked eye can perceive. Computed tomography, or CT scanning, allows researchers to peer through the parched skin and beneath the colorful burial shrouds without ever disturbing a single fiber. These scans reveal the internal architecture of the body, the state of the organs, the density of the bones, and the telltale signs of life's hardships. We see the healed fractures of a shepherd who fell in a rocky ravine 4,000 years ago. We see the wear on the teeth of a woman who spent her life grinding grain into flour. These digital slices of the past are then used for three-dimensional facial reconstruction, a process that feels almost like a slow-motion resurrection. As the software builds the musculature over the digital skull and the skin is layered over the muscle, the European features that so startled the first explorers become undeniable. The high bridges of the noses, the deep-set eyes, and the structure of the jawlines emerge from the shadows of time, looking less like ancient relics and more like people we might pass on a street in a modern city today. It is a haunting experience to watch a face from the Bronze Age take shape on a computer screen, to see the subtle curves of a lip, or the arch of a brow that has been hidden for 40 centuries. It brings an intimacy to the study of archaeology that transcends mere measurements and chemical signatures. Yet, this ability to see them so clearly brings with it a heavy weight of ethical responsibility. These are not merely specimens. They were fathers, daughters, and elders who were laid to rest with profound care by people who loved them. The decision to display these remains in museums or to subject them to invasive testing is a subject of constant, quiet debate within the scientific community. There is a tension between the thirst for knowledge, the desire to understand the origins of our species and the movements of our ancestors, and the respect due to the dead. In the quiet corridors of the Xinjiang Museum, the mummies lie behind glass in climate-controlled environments, their presence a silent testimony to a lost world. Some argue that by studying them, we give them a second life, ensuring that their culture and their struggles are never truly forgotten, while others wonder if the greatest respect we could show would be to return them to the embrace of the sand. The conservation process is an endless battle against the clock. Even in the most controlled environments, the organic materials, the vibrant reds and blues of the woolen tartans, the delicate leather of the boots, are susceptible to the slow decay of time and light. Conservators work with microscopic tools to stabilize the fibers, using chemical stabilizers to prevent the ancient proteins from breaking down. It is a work of extreme focus, often performed in near silence, where a single slip of a hand could erase a detail that has survived for millennia. They are preserving a window into the Younger Dryas and the subsequent warming periods, a time when the world was changing rapidly and humanity was forced to adapt or perish. And so, the work continues, moving between the high-tech laboratories and the lonely, windswept reaches of the desert. The shifting dunes still hold secrets that no satellite or ground-penetrating radar has yet glimpsed. There are likely hundreds, perhaps thousands, of burials still waiting beneath the salt crust of the Lop-Nur Basin, protected by the very environment that makes finding them so difficult. As we refine our techniques, as our DNA sequencing becomes more precise and our 3D models more lifelike, the people of the Tarim Basin draw closer to us. They are no longer just ghosts of the Silk Road. They are a tangible link to a deep and complicated past, a reminder that the boundaries we draw on maps today meant very little to the wanderers of the ancient world. As the night deepens and the hum of the laboratory equipment fades into the background, one cannot help but feel a sense of profound mystery. We have their faces, we have their clothes, and we have the genetic markers of their ancestors. And yet, so much remains unspoken. They held their secrets close in life, and they hold them still in the stillness of the museum halls. We are the latest in a long line of people to look upon them and wonder, and perhaps, in the end, that wonder is the most important thing we can preserve. The desert keeps its heart hidden, but occasionally, through the patience of the brush and the precision of the laser, it allows us a fleeting glimpse into the golden, shifting soul of what once was. The journey of the Tarim mummies is far from over. It is merely entering a new phase, where the digital and the physical meet to tell a story that began in the dust of a forgotten age. Deep within the fibers of a woven woolen cloak, dyed in shades of plum and ochre that have refused to fade, lies a truth that transcends the boundaries of maps and the rigid definitions of modern states. We often speak of the world in terms of binaries, the East and the West, separated by vast mountain ranges and the perceived isolation of the ancient world. Yet as we trace the delicate patterns of the Tarim textiles, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads where those distinctions begin to dissolve like salt in a desert spring. These silent travellers, with their high-arched noses and fair hair, do not merely represent a curiosity of migration, they challenge the very architecture of our historical memory. We are forced to reconsider the Silk Road not as a formal highway established by empires in the 2nd century before the Common Era, but as a much older, more organic web of human connection that had been pulsing with life for thousands of years before the first official diplomat ever set foot in the basin. The story of the Tarim mummies suggests that the world has always been a smaller, more intimate place than we dared to imagine. Long before the rise of the Great Wall or the expansion of the Roman sphere, there were people moving across the Eurasian steppe, carrying with them not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and the very blueprints of their cultures. The presence of these individuals in the heart of what is now China speaks of a deep-time connectivity, a subterranean river of movement that flowed through the Bronze Age and into the mist of prehistory. It reminds us that the human spirit is inherently restless, driven by a curiosity that ignores the barriers of geography and the harshness of the elements. In the face of the Taklamakan's shifting dunes, we see that East and West are perhaps nothing more than modern labels draped over a much more complex and integrated reality, a reality where a weaver in a desert oasis might share a technique with a kinsman thousands of miles to the west, linked by a lineage of knowledge that spanned the continent. As we look upon the objects left behind in the graves, the small baskets of grain, the wooden combs, the simple leather boots. We are struck by the profound universality of the human experience. These are not the grand monuments of kings or the cold steel of conquerors. They are the intimate possessions of mothers, fathers, and children. There is a gentleness in the way a felt hat was placed upon a head, or the way a sprig of ephedra was tucked into a shroud, that speaks across the millennia directly to our own hearts. It is in these small, quiet details that the distance of 4,000 years seems to vanish. We find that their concerns were our concerns, the desire for comfort, the rituals of grief, the hope that something of our essence might survive the passage of time. The archaeology of the Tarim Basin is, at its core, an archaeology of the soul, revealing that beneath the surface differences of genetics and geography, the fundamental ways in which we love and honor our dead have remained unchanged since the dawn of memory. And yet, for all the clarity provided by DNA and the precision of radiocarbon dating, that process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, a profound mystery still cloaks these lost tribes. We may know where they came from in a biological sense, but we still struggle to understand why they chose this specific unforgiving landscape. What was the catalyst that drove them into the salt-crusted depressions of the desert? Was it a search for new pastures, a flight from conflict, or perhaps a spiritual calling to the edge of the known world? The lost tribes of the basin remain elusive, their voices silenced by the wind, their ultimate fate a subject of quiet speculation. We see them arrive, we see them flourish in their sun-drenched oases, and then, as the climate shifted and the rivers began to retreat, we see them fade into the background of history, absorbed into the rising tide of new populations, or perhaps moving on once more into the unknown. There is a certain humility in acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. Despite our satellites and our laboratories, the desert still holds the final word. The Tarim mummies stand as sentinels at the border of our understanding, reminding us that history is not a straight line, but a vast, swirling tapestry where many threads are lost, and many others are woven together in ways we are only beginning to perceive. They invite us to look beyond the borders of our own time and place, to see ourselves as part of a much older and more intricate story of migration and survival. As the shadows lengthen over the salt flats of Lobnur, we are left with the image of those serene faces preserved in their eternal sleep, waiting for the next generation of seekers to uncover a few more fragments of their truth. The mystery does not diminish with discovery. Rather, it deepens, reminding us that the past is never truly gone, but merely waiting, just beneath the surface of the sand, for the moment it is called back into the light. The wind is the only voice that remains in the Taklamakan, a low rhythmic sigh that carries the fine golden dust across the ridges of the dunes. It moves with a slow, deliberate patience, erasing the footprints of the modern world as quickly as they are pressed into the earth, returning the landscape to a state of primordial silence. Here, in the vast stretches of the Tarim Basin, the air is so dry that time itself seems to have lost its edge, becoming as brittle and still as the salt crusts that line the edges of the ancient, evaporated lakes. We imagine the small wooden boats once used to navigate the life-giving waters of the Conque River, now sitting upright in the sand like skeletal ribs. They serve no purpose in this desiccated world, yet they hold their positions with a quiet dignity, marking the places where the dead were laid to rest beneath the weight of heavy ox hides. Beneath those hides, the mummies of the Xiaohe cemetery continue their long vigil, their skin turned to the color of dark mahogany, their woolen cloaks still vibrant with the dyes of plants that haven't bloomed in this valley for 3,000 years. There is a profound stillness in their presence, a sense that they are not merely remnants of history, but a part of the geology itself, as much a fixture of the desert as the granite peaks of the Kunlun Mountains that loom on the southern horizon. As we walk through the mental ruins of these lost settlements, we see the foundations of homes built from tamarisk branches and mud, now eroded into strange, jagged shapes that mimic the natural formations of the Yardangs. These were not a people of stone and marble. They did not build soaring monuments or write their names in massive inscriptions. They were a people of wood, wool, and leather, materials that usually vanish within a single human lifetime. And yet, through a rare alchemy of geography and climate, their most fragile possessions have outlived the empires of the West. A simple felt hat, adorned with a single feather, a small basket containing a handful of parched grains, a woven shroud with intricate swirling patterns that suggest a deep connection to the rhythms of the natural world. These objects speak to us in a whispered tongue, telling of a life lived in balance with a harsh, shifting environment before the rivers changed their course and the green corridors turned to ash. The desert has a way of humbling our notions of progress and permanence. We look at the sophisticated weaving techniques of the Tarim people, their knowledge of metallurgy, and their mastery of long-distance trade, and we realize that the divide between the ancient and the modern is thinner than we often care to admit. They were travelers, bridge builders between the East and the West, carrying the DNA of distant ancestors and the cultural seeds of future civilizations. Their presence here, in the dead heart of Asia, challenges the maps we have drawn and the stories we have told ourselves about how the world became what it is today. In the quiet of the night, when the temperature drops and the stars seem to descend toward the cold earth, one can almost feel the weight of the millennia pressing down. The Tarim mummies rest in a state of suspended animation, their eyes closed against the sun, their hands folded over their chests in a gesture of eternal patience. They have seen the rise and fall of the Silk Road. They have heard the bells of the camel caravans passing in the distance. They have watched the great cities of Nia and Lulan crumble into dust and disappear beneath the encroaching sands. They remain while everything around them has changed or faded or been forgotten. Perhaps the true secret of the Tarim is not where these people came from or what language they spoke, but the reminder they offer us about the nature of our own existence. We are all, in a sense, travelers in a vast and shifting landscape, leaving behind traces of our passage that may or may not be found by those who come after us. The desert does not judge, it only preserves. It keeps the secrets of the past locked away in its dry embrace, waiting for the wind to shift or the sand to move, revealing a face, a hand, or a fragment of a story that was never meant to be lost. As the years pass, the dunes will continue their slow migration across the basin, covering and uncovering the ruins of the Xiaohe and the tombs of Cherchen. The archaeology of the future may find even deeper layers, older stories buried beneath the stratigraphy of the Bronze Age, reaching back into the cold mists of the younger Dryas and the first tentative steps of humanity into these high, arid plains. But for now, the desert returns to its sleep. The voices of the seekers fade into the distance, leaving only the sound of the wind and the soft, steady ticking of the sand against the wood of the ancient boats. The mummies of the Tarim do not mind the silence. They have known it for thousands of years, and they will know it for thousands more. They are the guardians of a history that is still being written, a mystery that grows more beautiful the less we try to solve it. In the darkness of the tomb, in the cold heart of the earth, they remain as they were, still serene and perfectly preserved in the memory of the sand. The light fades from the horizon, and the sharp edges of the dunes soften into shadows. The vastness of the basin stretches out in every direction, a sea of stillness under a canopy of infinite stars. There is nothing left to do but listen to the quiet, to feel the slow pulse of deep time, and to let the desert keep what it has claimed. And so, we leave them there, resting in the cradle of the earth, while the wind continues its endless work of shaping the world. The secrets remain, the silence deepens, and the desert sleeps on, beneath the watchful eyes of the stars.